Okay, so we're going to be working with one very mysterious pasuk today and seeing the Shem MiShmuel and others, how we deal with it. What is this mysterious pasuk? Just at the very beginning of Aseres HaDibros is a pasuk, Vayedaber Elokim eis kol hadvarim ha'ele lemor. Hashem said all of these things, saying. Okay, and then it goes, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. So it sounds like an introductory pasuk, but it would really be unnecessary as an introductory pasuk. They're saying Hashem said all of these things, and then it says that Hashem said all of these things. So Rashi brings down this very mysterious thing. Es kol hadvarim ha'ele, all of these things, Melamed, this teaches us, Shamar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Aseres HaDibros b'dibur echad. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said all of the Aseres HaDibros simultaneously, in one utterance. That no human being can say. And, as he mentions, even just with Zachar and Shomer and Aseres HaDibros, that they were said simultaneously, we cannot hear something that is multiple words being said simultaneously in one instant. So when you bump into that Rashi, which is based on Chazal from the Medrash, is why? Why did he express the Aseres HaDibros in a way that nobody can understand, nobody can relate to, and then unpack the zip file and explain all of them pasuk by pasuk? What is the point of suddenly Am Yisrael are standing around the mountain waiting to be makabel, and there's this kind of wave of whether it was sound or it was something else, and everybody, what was that? And then the Aseres HaDibros start. So we'll look at two approaches from the Shem MiShmuel, and we'll try to see how that leads us to our approach to learning Torah in different ways today. A small piece in the Shem MiShmuel first. He says, this pasuk, Vayedaber Elokim es kol hadvarim ha'ele lemor. So nira lomar. It seems that we can explain it in the following way. He says, Shoresh HaNeshama, the roots of our neshama, before it gets down, what he calls Tehischalkus HaChushim, right? We have different levels of neshama. We see different words for neshama flying around, right? Nefesh, neshama, ruach, chaya, yechida, these different levels of neshama that we have. So there's a level of our neshama which exists above the world of our senses. Okay, in other words, usually the way in which I communicate with you is I can tell you words that you will absorb with your senses, and those will affect you. Those can enter your neshama, those can elevate you spiritually, but they're coming in through the world of the senses. There's a way to communicate directly with your higher self without going through that route. He says this is what was happening here. He says, Ulai hi bechinas yechida. That might be what Chazal called this level called yechida. And therefore, kibla to'eles mimaimer zeh haklali kamo shehu klali. So just as I have a spiritual side to myself, which is above this world that you identify with me, that has to do with my nose and my ears and my eyes and all of this, so too the Torah exists in a form even above where it gets divided up into all the different words and letters. So there was an injection, so to speak, here of the Torah in its raw state, I guess if you'd say, to our neshama in its raw state in the beginning. And then he spoke in a way that we could understand and we could absorb. Okay, so why do it? Why go through the bother? He says, Zelimud l'kol ish hatorud b'inyonim shonim, asher bilti efshar lo liyashiv daito lilmud. This is a very, very important lesson day to day for a person who is involved with lots of things and has lots of worries, and he's not able to focus his mind on learning. Okay, one of the great challenges we have in Yiddishkeit is the centrality of Torah learning, and the fact that Torah learning, while it's obviously spiritual, the gateway seems to be intellectual. In order to access Torah, I have to learn Torah, I have to understand Torah. And what can I do when my head's just not there? right? I'm so caught up in the whirlwinds of the different thoughts and troubles and bothers that I have in my life, I can't focus. I can't get into it. So a person may think, okay, I'll have to wait to learn till my mind is up to it. Says no. Al yashgiach al zeh, pay no attention to it. El yaschil limud, start to learn. Afal gav de lo yoda mai ka'amar, even though you don't know what you're saying. Read the words. Somebody comes, taps you on the shoulder, and says, what are you learning? I actually don't know. Right? I don't have the foggiest. Right? It's like, he says, why? Ki afal gav de ihu lo yoda, because even though it's true, that person doesn't have the answer to that question. What are you learning now? And I don't know. Shoresh haneshama yodea. Just as the Torah does not exist only in the level of paper and letters here in this book, but the Torah exists on all levels of existence, so too I am not just what's inside the basar v'dagim, right, of this body, but I exist beyond this as well. So when I'm trying to learn Torah, even though through that pathway that I can identify, the intellectual pathway where I'm saying I'm not getting it, but the neshama of the Torah, so to speak, is connecting with the neshama in you. And that has a purpose. Now, you may ask, okay, how long am I going to do that though? Right? It sounds pretty frustrating. I pat you on the shoulder and say, well, it's true you don't understand it, but I bet your neshama is really having a good time. Okay, how long can you go? He says, obviously, the goal, he says, Bishvil zeh la'at la'at nimshechu gam yeser chelkei nafsho la'Torah. You have to realize that the power of your neshama, of the higher levels of your neshama, as it connects with Torah and as it's magnified, that enables you to connect with the Torah, to learn the Torah and to understand it properly. Until he will be able to, right, get his mind to be able to understand it. So the goal, obviously, is not just to chant Torah. Okay, I once saw a description of somebody, sociologist, anthropologist, somebody trying to observe yeshiva students. I saw many young men in the room chanting, right, the Talmud. Okay, we don't chant. We're trying to learn. So it's important to vocalize when you learn. That's true. But he says the goal is to be able to understand it. But the gateway sometimes is starting, even though you, in terms of what's inside the coconut here, doesn't understand, but there's much more above and beyond that coconut. Okay, so this is why he says, don't give up. He says, Lo yamtin ad sheyafana daito. Don't wait until your mind is able to be clear and focused and be able to understand on it. So here he's referring to a very famous statement of his grandfather. His grandfather had a very beautiful perush on what it says in Pirkei Avos. In Pirkei Avos it says, Al tomer lech she'efne eshne, don't say when I have time I'm going to learn, shema lo tipone. Perhaps you will never get free time. So the way people usually explain this, the rabbi trying to push the people in his shul, to come to the weekly shir, he says, let's take an example, of Mr. Jones, and I say, why don't you come to the shir? Rabbi, I'm so busy, I got to run my corporation, all these things. When I retire, I'm going to come. And then he retires, and the next day, heart failure, he never got to come to shul. Okay, don't wait for that, come to shir now. But there's a deeper way that the Kotzker explained it. He said, Al tomer she'efne eshne is in terms of panui, of my mind being free. The word panui means free, open, able to absorb. Don't say, I'm only going to learn when I do that. The Kotzker says you may want to do that out of respect for Torah. That's not learning. Learning is meant to be that I'm focused. Learning is meant to be that I absorb, that I understand. When you look at it, I was just looking at a portion from the Tanya, he says it's true. Every bit of you that's not there in the learning means less connection with the learning, and you're trying to absorb the learning entirely inside of you, 100%. But don't say that when I'm panui, and only when I'm panui am I going to learn. What's the answer of the Mishnah? Shema lo tipone. The Kotzker said it in Yiddish, he said, Efshe bista lo tipone mensch. Meaning, who gave you that life? That life of difficulty and troubles and worries that cause your mind to be so caught up in thoughts that it can't free itself to focus. Who gave you the life that you're so exhausted that when you do try to open a sefer and learn, you fall asleep? And the next day you can't remember. Hashem gave you that life. And therefore that Torah that you bring into the world through that process is the Torah that you were meant to bring in. You say, yeah, but nobody's going to be impressed by that Torah. Doesn't have to be impressed by it. That's your Torah. That's the Torah of your life. Don't wait for another life to learn, because it's there every day. So he says, Yigros afal gavdlo yoda maka omar. There's a verb for learning which is called girsa, yigros. Literally it means to grind. Grind, right? Grinding, he says, even if you don't know what you're saying. Torah learning gets into you just by learning more and more of it, by saying the words, by reading it, right? And this is, he says, the goal is not that you're going to remain that way. The goal is that you will come to understand. But he says, nonetheless, Chazal said, ligmarinish v'hodar lizbar. First learn on the most basic possible way you can, even just reading the words, and then come to understand. So here he's adding a much deeper level to this than the technical that's usually explained. The technical thing is a person's trying to explain skills for Torah study, and they say, well, you know, like with any language, you have to get used to it, you have to pronounce the words often, you have to see a lot of pieces, a lot of the vocabulary, a lot of the things, and it gets into you. That's true, but here he's saying there's much more. He says, you'll be interacting with the Torah, even on a very high level, because there's a very high level of you that you're not in touch with that'll be connected with that and will be able to absorb it. Okay, so this is his first approach to the purpose of that. And it's very important, it's very key for what we do and how we do. But the next piece, I think, will make it clear in another way. It starts off with another episode in our Pasha. Yisro, Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, comes to visit him. And it says, Vayishtachu vayishaklo. He bowed down to him and he kissed him. The only problem is, two people were meeting. It says he bowed down to him and he kissed him. Who bowed down and kissed who? Rashi says, I don't know. Who bowed down to who? Was it Yisro bowing down to Moshe and kissing Moshe? Or that Moshe bowing down to Yisro and kissing Yisro? So he says, well, it says, Ish l're'ehu, man to his fellow man, to his friend. And we know that Ish is Moshe, because in another pasuk it says, Va'ish Moshe. So it was Moshe Rabbeinu who came out, he bowed down to his father-in-law, and he kissed his father-in-law. Okay? So what's going on? Why did Moshe Rabbeinu do this? He says it wasn't just politeness, it wasn't just greeting, it wasn't just warming up the family relationship. He says that my father, Avnei Nezer, explained in the following way. Yisro sent a message to Moshe Rabbeinu before he came. He said, Ani chosencha Yisro bo elecha. I, your father-in-law Yisro, are coming to you. Say begini, come out because of me. Seems a little bit arrogant. You know, the father-in-law is playing the father-in-law card a bit much. I expect you to be waiting there to greet me when I come. I'm your father-in-law. Let's not forget that. So, doesn't seem to be. He says, Einena chaser shalom bakoshas hakavod. Yisro was not asking Moshe Rabbeinu to make sure that he gives him honor as a father-in-law. Bikesh mi Moshe sheyetzi mi madregoso apnimis v'ne'elemes v'yashpil es atzmo elev b'chtei shia b'cholos Yisro lizdavik bo. Yisro was on a journey. Why did Yisro leave Midian and come out there to the Midbar to join Am Yisrael? Because he realized he needed to connect. He needed to be able to receive from what Moshe and Bnei Yisrael received in their experiences of Yetzias Mitzrayim and what they were having in the Midbar. Okay? But then, V'yis'ale ito baloso chazor l'madregoso. He said, Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm coming from afar. I'm coming from afar. I've not experienced what you've experienced. Not the people in general, and certainly not you. I want you to come down from your lofty, hidden spiritual level. Come down to me and help me go up to join you. Okay? He says this is why Moshe Rabbeinu bowed down to him. That means Moshe Rabbeinu came down from his level. He came down to where Yisro was in order to bring him up. The kiss, he says, a kiss is not something simple. It's described in Sfarim as hizdabkus rucha berucha. Spirit is connecting with spirit, soul with soul. After he bowed down to him and he connected his spirit to Yisro's spirit, then Yisro was able to come up with him to very high levels. Right? Sometimes this idea of a kiss, even in halacha, there's the idea of connecting waters of a mikveh to another, right, cistern with water. If there's a little hole between them that's opened up, that's called hashaka, the water's kiss. And those other waters now are transformed, and they also have the powers of a mikveh. He says we found this also with the Rus and Orpah as they were accompanying Nomi when she left back to Eretz Yisrael. So, right, Nomi was trying to raise them up, right, to go with her. With Orpah, it didn't work. It says that Orpah kissed her, Vatishak Orpah lechamosa. He said there the kiss was going in the opposite direction. Orpah kissed her, so to speak, to take her spirit back, and she went back to her nation. The Rus dovkabo, but Rus continued on. That kiss wasn't broken. So he says this is what Moshe Rabbeinu was doing with Yisro at the time. Okay, now it's a very nice and beautiful parish. What's it have to do with our first piece about that pasuk that said all of the Aseres HaDibros at one time? He says, Dugma didei, the example for this is what happened at Matan Torah. The Aseres HaDibros, he said, are described as nishikin. Right? He doesn't bring the source. It sounds like in the Zohar HaKadosh, they were kisses to Bnei Yisrael. Yishakeni minashikas piyah, as we say in Shir HaShirim. The beloved asked that he should kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. So this is what happened with Am Yisrael, right? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu was giving a kiss to Bnei Yisrael. Says the Gemara in Yevamos asks, how is it possible that Moshe Rabbeinu learned Torah from Hashem? And if they asked that question about Moshe Rabbeinu, certainly about Bnei Yisrael. So the kiss enabled them to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It raised them up to the level that they would be able to receive the Aseres HaDibros. So he says that kiss, the initial kiss, was saying all the Aseres HaDibros in that one instant that they couldn't even understand. It's true. On their level, that was meaningless. But it was an idea of a level beyond where they were at, coming down and connecting them and enabling them to raise up to this idea of a nevuah that every single Jew experienced and to receive the Torah. Okay, so he says that this taught us, right, that they were able to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they were able to receive, and there's an idea of the Torah coming into the world in such a lofty way, even though you can't grasp it, but it raises you up, and then when the connection is formed, you're able to grasp it. Okay, he says a similar pattern actually happens on Shabbos, with the idea of the Neshama Yisera coming. How can you connect to Shabbos? That idea of the Neshama Yisera, again, is a kiss that comes down to you that enables you to rise up and to connect to Shabbos. He brings from the Zmiros of Yisav Bazuge Dehavas Perisha. You marry, so to speak, that partner that you were separated from. Okay, so we have these two pieces here. One is the idea of when you learn, you're able to absorb. There are aspects of you that are able to absorb, even if intellectually you're not understanding right now. The second is that the revealing the Torah in its incomprehensible infinity, above and beyond of what we're usually able to grasp here, was important. They got something out of that. Even though you say the ear can't understand it, but it suddenly let them connect to what Torah really is. That they wouldn't be learning the Jewish code of laws, they wouldn't be learning the book of Jewish traditions. They were going to be learning something that was from beyond this world. And that's key for when you approach Torah. So this has to do a lot with our debates a bit about what should I learn. On one hand, right, it makes sense to learn what you understand. Okay, oh, this is a really hard sefer. I don't understand the word. I guess I'll learn that and I'll be immersed with the idea of the incomprehensibility of Torah. That doesn't make sense, right? That's not using the time properly that you have to learn Torah. On the other hand, if a person doesn't realize the majesty of what he's learning, doesn't realize that in a simple halacha that he's learning, an apparently simple halacha, a simple Mishnah, there's infinity, so you're not really learning Torah either. So there has to be some combination between the two. You have to have that exposure in certain ways to those levels of Torah so that you can appreciate and understand things that may appear to be mundane to you because the Torah comes down into absolutely every level of our life. But you have to realize where it comes from, and that tells you something about yourself as well. It says that you have a connection to Torah, not just in terms of how I set up my kitchen not to meat and milk and mix meat and milk. You have a connection to Torah on a level which is above the world, above the intellect, and that changes and affects you. So listen to a fascinating description, a story about a really amazing man. His name was Rav Mordechai Pogromansky. Rav Mordechai Pogromansky was known as the greatest genius in all of Lithuania. He had learned in the Telz Yeshiva. He was really off the charts in all ways. One fascinating aspect is that when the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Riyatz, was in Latvia, in was it Lida?
He was in
Riga, right? So he sent to Telz. He had heard of this Rav Mordechai Pogromansky, and he brought him to come to be a Maggid Shir in the yeshiva there. It was a very fascinating incident, right? To the extent that he stopped doing what was usual in the Lithuanian yeshivas, which was shaving, right? Because out of covet he was going to be going to teach now in a Lubavitch yeshiva, so he grew a beard. So some of the people who knew him said, "You grow a beard for a Rebbe?" He said, "Better to grow a beard for a Rebbe than to shave for a girl." Right? That was his statement on that. Okay, now he forged relationships with a lot of the young Talmidim and Telz, a lot of the people, especially ones who came from Chutz La'aretz. It was interesting, in the pre-war period, there were Talmidim who came even from America and Western Europe to learn in the Lithuanian yeshivas. One of those was Mordechai Gifter, who was originally from, I think, Virginia or Baltimore. And he came there to Telz. He eventually was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Telz Yeshiva in America. And he talks about how he would go to visit Rav Mordechai Pogromansky. He was such a charismatic person that when he would walk into the Beis Medrash, all of the Talmidim in the Beis Medrash would cluster around him, and he felt uncomfortable about that. So he just lived in a little apartment in town, and those people who wanted to speak with him often would come and talk to him. So Rav Gifter described the following. And again, let's remember, he was a young student. He said, "One evening, I came to visit Rav Mordechai Pogromansky, and he was involved in the Sefer Leshem Shvo V'Achlama, which was written by the great Makubal Rav Shlomo Yoshev Zatzal. This was the grandfather of Rav Yoshev, the famous posek. He was one of the great Makubalim of the generation. He said, right, I think they say that when his book reached Baghdad, the Ben Ish Chai made a yontiv or something. There was some. He made a suda in honor of that his sefer. Okay, so he said, when I came in, he asked me to join him in the learning. He says, I'm studying the topic of les asar panui minei, that there is no place in existence that the presence of Hashem is not there. And he says the author of the Sefer was going through understanding the approach of the Vilna Gaon. So I said, no, I really don't think this is for me. I've never studied any of this stuff. I'd rather not. And he said, no, I want you to do this, and I'll explain it to you, and it will be clear to you. He said, I remember it like today. I sat there from 8 in the evening until after midnight. And he spoke nonstop, explaining, I'm listening, asking, understanding. Everything was very clear. He says, and I can tell you when I say it was clear that at the time I understood it with omek and hekef, with depth and with breadth. He says, at that moment, I started to have a thought in my head that this is amazing. When I go back to yeshiva, I'm going to have to tell all of my friends what I learned tonight. But when we finished to learn, and I walked back to the yeshiva, I found that the wellspring was closed, and I couldn't remember anything anymore. But he finished like this. He says, don't think that I wasted my time. It's not true. He says, as the Rambam says in his introduction to the Mer Nevuchim, about the thoughts of Torah, that it's like lightning, that sometimes a lightning bolt comes that lights up the darkness of night, and when that lightning bolt strikes, you can suddenly see things that you never saw before. He says, so too, in that experience I had with him with that Torah, it opened up areas in my heart. It awakened feelings in my nefesh that I was never aware of before, and the impression of that learning that night lasted with me forever. Okay, so this is an important side. That was a neshika. That was a neshika. That's what he was trying to do to him. He was trying to say, I know that you're not at the level, you're not involved in what I'm doing, but I want you to know it's here. I want you to experience it even momentarily, and then, even when you go back to a world that you're learning other things, and you don't have me there to explain this to you, you will know that that's part of Torah and behind every bit of Torah that you learn. Perhaps, and I don't know exactly what he did, but this is just a fascinating thing to mention, eventually he moved to Kovna, and in Kovna, he was very involved with Jewish students in the university in Kovna. Again, this was a time in which more rights were being given to Jews. Many young Jews were in the university. And Rav Mottel would say, he says, they come into me without a kippah, and they go out with a kippah, and they kiss the mezuzah. We don't know what he did in those learning sessions with those university students. But it seems that the same goal was there. That goal was to be able to raise them up, to be able to get a sense of what Torah is, and then everything can go from there. Okay, so that's why it's important to know, to see, to realize that it's there even if you can't grasp it. There was one time I was at a Suda in my Rosh Hashiva's house, Rabbi Shechter Shlita, and he used to learn Chumash and Rashi at the Suda. And there was one guy there who used to like to get the Suda to be a bit more lively by trying to get him worked up a bit, asking some provocative questions. So he asked once, he said, Rebbe, I have a question. I said, yes. He says, it says that the snake talked. It says, you know and I know that in order to pronounce words, you need a certain shape of mouth and palate. Snakes don't have such a mouth. How could the snake speak? So the Rosh Hashiva very calmly flipped to a Ramban, and he read to him that the Ramban said, when we speak about the snake, we're speaking about a force called the Nachash Elyon, the upper snake, right? That there's a force in the world that's called the snake. There are reasons why it's described as a snake. And he said, that should answer your question. And the guy said, no, I guess that means I'm not getting an answer, right? So there, the Rosh Hashiva blew up a little bit. He said, why do you have to take everything which is grand and vast in the universe and shrink it into the small confines of your mind? Meaning, it's true, it can seem frustrating that I asked you a very simple practical question and you start reading to me about the great spirit Nachash that exists someplace. And I want to understand this nuts and bolts. But the Torah is not limited to that level, right? You have to rise up to the level of the Torah. And even if you can't grasp it, you have to know it and you have to understand that it's there. Now, this works in all the different ways. Meaning, when we remember in the first piece, that Moshe Rabbeinu came to bow down to Yisro, to come down from his Madrega in order to raise Yisro up. Okay, so there are two different ways of this bowing down and this neshika. There's the way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu came and gave us all of these words and raised us up. And that also is an idea of a description, when Chazal described that the Shemayim came down to this world at Matan Torah. It was an idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu coming down to us. And so too Moshe Rabbeinu came down to Yisro, but with the purpose not of being down there, right? Sometimes people feel, okay, I got to bring the Torah down to people's level. Okay, in Hebrew there's a whole approach to it. It's called to teach Torah begova ha'einayim. Okay, that's shrinking the Torah, right? In order to make it, so to speak, relatable, right? You turn it into a soap opera, you turn it into a, family squabble, you turn it into the customs and laws of Hammurabi's code or whatever else was going around the Middle East at the time. That's not what's meant by the hishtachavoya and the neshika of the going down. What's meant there is going down in a way that you can connect the person to understand the infinity of Torah, to understand what Torah is, and then they'll be able to do the hard work of the slow work of understanding Torah step by step, piece by piece. So, another aspect of this infinity, a beautiful story that's a big key for chinuch, about the Chidush Harim, the first Ger Rebbe. Talmud Rebbe tells this often. So the Chidush Harim was, once again, a genius. I should note, not every Gadol B'Yisrael was a genius when they were little, right? There were many who started later, but he was. In fact, we have a whole shelf of Svarim written by the Chidush Harim on all areas of Torah. He wrote all of those by the time he was 18. After he was 18, he stopped writing Svarim. Okay, now he had a yeshiva in Poland, where some of the greatest minds in Poland were learning. One day, a very country-looking Jew comes in with his very country-looking teenage son. And he walks over to the Chidush Harim. He says, "You a rabbi?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "They tell me you're a big one." He said, "Listen," he said, I've had teachers from my kid here, they haven't been able to teach him anything. He doesn't know anything. I figure I'm going to go for the best. I want you to teach him." The Harim looked at the kid there in his overalls and everything, and he said, "All right, leave him with me." So he started learning with him one-on-one. He set up some chavrusas for him, and slowly, the boy progressed. The story doesn't end, and he became the great whatever, but he progressed. So somebody came over to the Chidush Harim, asked him, he says, "You've never taught children before. You've certainly never taught special needs children before. How did you succeed when other professional teachers failed?" He said, "I had to try to think in my mind, why didn't it work? I tried to put myself in the shoes of this boy. At one point, he was in the same class with everybody else. They came in kindergarten together. They learned Aleph Beis. He was slow on the uptake on the Aleph Beis. The other boys moved up a grade. He was still back working on the Aleph Beis. Another year comes, maybe he got past the Aleph Beis, but everyone his age was shooting forward. He's sitting with boys younger than him. And the teacher, seeing this overgrown child in the class, thinks, my goodness, this guy is so far away from where I am. And every year, the distance between the Talmud and the Rebbe simply became bigger and bigger and bigger, to the extent that it was a gap that would never be bridged. I did a rethink. I said, they say I learned a lot of Torah, but how much Torah did I really learn? The Torah is chova mini yam, more vast than the ocean. Right? It says it's endless. It's the literal drinking a teaspoon, right? Trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. As much Torah as I learned, I'm at the very beginning of Torah. So really, I'm a beginner, and he's a beginner. We're really kind of at the same place. If the book is 1,000,000 pages long, so one person says, "Where are you?" "Oh, I'm at page 250. Really, I'm at page 350. It's 1,000,000 pages long. You're both at the beginning. It's like when you go in an airplane, right? As you go up, the higher you go up, the distance between the buildings shrinks. Suddenly, the huge towers and the little houses, you don't see that difference anymore so much. They're all very far away. They're all very small. So the Chidush Harim said, when I had that approach, that we're both at the same place, I was able to connect with him, and that's how he was able to connect to Torah. So that's one very important idea of this hishtachavoya, of this neshika. That is the template of teaching Torah that's given to us by the ultimate teacher of Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the very beginning. That was the template that Yisro knew he needed from Moshe Rabbeinu in order to be able to progress. So if there's a sense of ascendancy, to the extent that you're low down there and I'm all the way up here, it isn't going to work. Right? This is something that we've learned very much. And a person has to realize also that many times you have the ability, right, to get in touch with someone and to expose to them a little bit of what Torah is. Try not to transform the Torah for them. Try to reveal the Torah in its majesty, but doing it in ways that they can hear, right, and can aspire to and grasp. I'll share a story that moved me very much. It's interesting. There's a famous character here in Israel called Rabbi Uri Zohar. Right? Why was Uri Zohar famous? Because before he became observant, he was Israel's #1 entertainment personality. I spoke with people who grew up in Israel during the Uri Zohar years. He had a weekly television show. They said the streets were like Yom Kippur when his show was on. Nobody was out. Everyone was glued. He made famous movies. He was in all the society pages. He was a very funny person. He was a producer. He was an actor. He was very talented. And during the 1970s, at one point, through some friends who introduced him to some rabbis, and he asked his questions, and he started on this journey, and he became frum in a very serious way, and this shocked the country. It was a fascinating thing, and he became a very serious Talmid Chacham. Now, I heard him tell his story different ways, but there was one aspect of the story that I once heard that I hadn't heard him tell before. See, he was married when this whole thing went down. And his wife was not on this trip with him. This was something he did. And they had been married for a while. They grew up in the same very non-religious youth movements. At the time, he was living in a beautiful mansion in Yaffo by the ocean. And he said one night they had the talk. And by the talk, he meant, could they continue to remain married? Meaning, if he was committed to this, and he was, there had to be at least certain compromises. Would she agree to keep Shabbos, Kashrus, Taras HaMishpacha at home so that they could continue to live together and be together? He said, we spoke into the night, and our conclusion was that we had to break up. We would have to get divorced. He said, I was very sad and broken. I was walking upstairs to my room. As I walked upstairs, I looked down at her once more. I had recently started buying sets of Jewish books, he said. I'd bought a set of the Rambam. I saw her reach out, take out a volume of the Rambam. The next morning when I came down, she was waiting for me. I don't know if she had slept or not. She said, I can do those things you wanted. He said, I was burning with curiosity. What did she read in the Rambam that changed her mind? But I was so afraid to mess with it, I didn't ask anything. He said, I was just so happy. Months later, when I felt more secure, I approached her. I said, that night when we had that talk, I saw you take out a volume of the Rambam. I saw you open it. The next morning you told me you could. What did you learn in there that changed your mind? She said, to tell you the truth, lo ivanti mila. I didn't understand the word that was in it. She said, aval ra'iti sheze retzini. I saw that it's serious. Suddenly I saw that there's a world of formulations and commentaries that are asking questions and answering and citations from here and from there. I didn't know what it was, but this was not the old woman's tales or folklore traditions that I thought this was. Suddenly I saw that this is something very ancient, very powerful, very deep, and very serious. And with that, I was able to do these things even though I didn't understand them yet, because I was able to sense what that was. That was an example of such an ishika of Torah which was there. To be able to see and to sense and to expose it. The Torah does this because it's powerful. We don't have to shrink the Torah to somebody else. We do have to explain it in ways that's appropriate for each person who's learning to be able to do it, but there's a power in the Torah that affects. There's something that Rav Wolbe writes, and when I read it, I was a little bit skeptical about it. He said the power of Torah to affect a person is in any piece of Torah. Doesn't matter, right? We know there's certain pieces of Torah we're more excited about, less excited about. It says absolutely everything, right? Just as the Rambam says that a person must believe that every word in Torah is just as holy as the other. Achos lotan timna, one of these, this one was the sister of that one, has the same kedusha as the Aseres HaDibros that we have in this week's parsha. He says, therefore, every pasuk in Torah has power to transform and deal with a person, as long as the person is open to that interaction. So like I said, I learned it and I was thinking, I don't know, if I get invited to speak to a group of birthright students and I'll say, okay, we're going to learn the laws of when you sell a house in a walled city, When can you redeem it? And when is it totally with the buyers and you can't redeem it anymore? I don't think I would do that, okay? So, and then my eyes were opened by somebody that I met. It was a gentleman, an Israeli fellow who, like many Israelis, had gone over to India. And he told me, yeah, I spent a lot of time in India. And I was, examining the spirituality they had over there and doing my things. Meanwhile, my brother back in Israel, he was Choser B'Tshuva, and he became very religious. And on one of my visits back, so I saw I was learning this thing, and he said, "You want to learn with me?" And I said, "Okay." And whoa, I felt it. I said, I saw it. That was it. That was me. I was the Torah was me. That's it. I said, whoa, what did you learn? He said, it was in Masechet Brachot. There's this plant called tzlaf, the caper bush, and there are different brachot which are made on different parts of the bush, right? Because you can eat the leaves, you can eat the flowers, you can eat the berries. The question is, what gets ha'etz, what gets ha'adama? I said, that was what did it? He said, yep. I'm like, how? He says, I'll tell you my theory. He said, toward the end, when I was in India, I got very serious about eating strictly vegetarian, vegan, something or other. He said, could be that cleared the pipes in my system, that I was receptive to Torah, and there's Kedusha every place in Torah. All I had to do was connect with one piece, and the wires connected, and that was it. So it's important to know that that's there. It's important to search for it, right? But also, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives each of us lightning bolts of our own. There are parts of Torah that come to you as that lightning bolt that opens up the sky and lets you see things. That closes afterwards. But you knew that it was there. Just like at Matan Torah. It says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu opened all the rakim, all the skies, let us see. Ata reis ladas ki Hashem Elokim ein od milvado. But then that closed up. Said, now it's time to learn, now it's time to do. But remember what the Torah is, remember who you are, and remember that it's all a kiss from me to you. Have a wonderful week, a wonderful Shabbos.